If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Epstein's final days and jail conditions. The clock was ticking inside the gray walls of the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Jeffrey Epstein had just 6 days left to live, though nobody knew it yet. What happened during those final days would raise more questions than answers. On July 23rd, guards found Epstein on his cell floor with marks around his neck. The official report said he tried to hurt himself. Within hours, doctors placed him on suicide watch. This meant someone would watch him every single minute. He could not harm himself, or so they thought. But something strange happened next. After just 6 days, the doctors took him off suicide watch. They said he was no longer a danger to himself. The decision came from Dr. Heidi Kraus, a prison psychologist. She met with Epstein and decided he was safe to return to his regular cell. The timing seemed odd. Most prisoners stay on suicide watch much longer after such incidents. Epstein had just tried to end his life, yet within a week, they trusted him alone again. Prison experts later called this decision unusual. On July 30th, another change occurred. Prison officials moved Epstein's cellmate, Efrain Reyes, to a different location. This left Epstein alone in his cell. Prison rules stated that inmates like Epstein should never be left alone. Someone should always share the cell with him. Guards were supposed to check on Epstein every 30 minutes. Camera footage would prove whether this happened or not. These checks were part of the prison's most basic safety rules. During his final week, Epstein signed something important. On August 8th, just 2 days before his death, he updated his will. The document moved his wealth into a trust. This made it harder for victims to claim his money in court. Why did he choose this exact moment to change his will? Prison records show other odd details from these days. Epstein wrote notes complaining about his treatment. He said guards were too rough with him. He claimed they woke him up every few hours during the night. The night before he died, something went wrong with the prison's normal routine. The guards who were supposed to watch his section fell asleep. The cameras that should have recorded everything stopped working. Both guards later admitted they spent hours shopping online instead of doing their rounds. On the morning of August 10th, guards found Epstein hanging in his cell. The official story said he used bedsheets tied to his bunk, but many people wondered how so many safety measures could fail at once. These final days created a puzzle that still has no clear answer. Each strange coincidence made the mystery deeper. 3 weeks before he died, guards found Jeffrey Epstein on his cell floor with strange marks around his neck. Nobody knows exactly what happened that night in July. Some say he tried to hurt himself. Others whispered that maybe someone else was involved. The prison doctors moved him to suicide watch right away. This meant someone had to watch him every single minute. He couldn't have sheets or anything he might use to harm himself. A guard sat outside his cell around the clock. Cameras recorded his every move. But suicide watch is not comfortable. Prisoners wear paper gowns that tear easily. They sleep on thin mats. The lights stay on all day and night. For someone like Epstein, who was used to luxury, this felt like torture. After 6 days, something changed. Prison psychiatrists came to see him. They asked questions about his mental state. Did he want to hurt himself? Was he feeling hopeless? Epstein told them he was fine now. He said he wanted to help with his legal case. He acted calm and spoke clearly about his future plans. The doctors made a choice that would later seem very important. They decided Epstein was no longer a danger to himself. On July 29th, they took him off suicide watch. This meant he could return to a regular cell with normal bedding and fewer guards watching him. But the prison still tried to keep him safe. They put him in a special unit where guards were supposed to check on prisoners every 30 minutes. They gave him a cellmate so he wouldn't be alone. These steps seemed reasonable at the time. The psychiatrists wrote in their reports that Epstein seemed hopeful. He talked about fighting the charges against him. He mentioned wanting to see his lawyers. Nothing in his behavior suggested he was planning anything dangerous. Yet some people who knew about prisons found this decision strange. Epstein was facing serious charges that could put him in jail forever. His reputation was destroyed. Many powerful people wanted him to stay quiet about what he knew. Why would doctors think he was completely safe? The move off suicide watch meant fewer eyes on Epstein. Instead of constant observation, he now had guards who might get distracted. Instead of a camera watching him every second, he had privacy in parts of his cell. 2 weeks later, both his cellmate was transferred away and the cameras stopped working. The timing felt too perfect to be chance. The small concrete cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center held more secrets than its gray walls revealed. Jeffrey Epstein spent his final days in a cramped space with little natural light. The air was thick and stale. His bed was a thin mattress on a metal frame. A small toilet sat in the corner. The only window was a narrow slit that barely let in sunlight. Prison records show that Epstein wrote complaints about the guards. He claimed they treated him poorly. Some guards, he said, would make loud noises at night to wake him up. Others would bang on his cell door for no reason. The note was found later, written in his own handwriting. It painted a picture of a man who felt trapped and tormented. But something else happened during these final days that raised even more questions. On August 8th, just 2 days before his death, Epstein signed his last will and testament. This timing struck many as odd. Why would someone create a will so close to their death if they had no plans to die? The will itself contains surprising details. Epstein had moved his vast fortune into a trust. This made it much harder for his victims to claim money through lawsuits. The document was prepared quickly and signed with witnesses present. Prison officials allowed the meeting to happen in a special room. Legal experts found this sequence of events puzzling. Most people do not suddenly decide to organize their affairs unless they know something is coming. The will protected his money from those who might try to take it after his death. It seemed like the worth of someone who knew his time was running out. The guards who watched Epstein during these final days later gave conflicting stories about his behavior. Some said he seemed calm and normal. Others claimed he appeared anxious and scared. These different accounts made it hard to understand his true state of mind. Meanwhile, the cell conditions grew worse. The lights stayed on all night. The temperature was either too hot or too cold. Food came at irregular times. Sleep became nearly impossible. These conditions would break down anyone's mental state over time. The note about guard mistreatment was not the only thing Epstein wrote. He also made phone calls to his lawyers almost every day. What they discussed remains mostly secret due to attorney-client privilege. But these conversations happened right up until his final night. As August 10th approached, all these factors came together like pieces of a dark puzzle. The harsh cell conditions, the freshly signed will, the complaints about guards, and the constant legal meetings painted a picture of a man under extreme pressure from all sides. Discovery of Epstein's death and official findings. The morning of August 10th, 2019, started like any other at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. But by dawn, everything had changed forever. At 6:30 a.m., correctional officers made their routine rounds through the special housing unit. They approached cell number 207, where Jeffrey Epstein had spent his final night. What they found would spark questions that echo to this day. Epstein lay motionless on the floor of his cell. A bedsheet was tied around his neck and secured to the upper bunk. The officers immediately called for medical assistance and began life-saving efforts. Every second counted now. Prison medical staff rushed to the scene. They worked frantically to revive him, but their efforts seemed futile. Time was running out. Emergency responders transported Epstein to New York Presbyterian Hospital, where doctors continued the fight for his life. Despite every attempt to save him, Jeffrey Epstein was pronounced dead at 7:36 a.m. The news would soon spread around the world, but first came the investigation. The New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner took charge of determining what happened. Dr. Barbara Sampson, the chief medical examiner, ordered a complete autopsy. The process would take weeks, but the findings would shape everything that followed. On August 16th, Dr. Sampson released her official ruling. The cause of death was suicide by hanging. The manner of death was officially classified as suicide. According to the report, Epstein had used torn bedsheets to fashion a noose, which he attached to his bunk bed. The medical examiner found evidence consistent with hanging. There were injuries to Epstein's neck that matched this conclusion. The hyoid bone in his throat was broken, which can happen during hanging, especially in older individuals. Epstein was 66 years old, but even with these official findings, something felt wrong to many people. How had this happened in one of America's most secure federal facilities? Why weren't the guards watching more carefully? These questions would only grow louder in the days ahead. The medical examiner's report should have closed the case. In most situations, an official ruling from such a respected office would be accepted without question. Yet this case was different. The circumstances surrounding Epstein's death seemed too convenient for some, too suspicious for others. Prison officials began their own internal investigation. The FBI opened a separate inquiry. But for many observers, the damage was already done. Trust had been broken. The official story, no matter how thoroughly documented, would face intense scrutiny from skeptics who believed there had to be more to this story than suicide. Within hours of the medical examiner's announcement, the first cracks began to show. Attorney General William Barr stood before reporters with a grim expression. His words carried weight that would echo for months to come. "This represents a perfect storm of screw-ups," Barr declared. The nation's top law enforcement official wasn't defending the prison system. Instead, he was admitting that something had gone terribly wrong. Barr's statement sent shockwaves through the Justice Department. If the Attorney General himself was calling it a disaster, what did that say about the official story? His choice of words seems strange for a simple suicide case. Why use the phrase "perfect storm" unless multiple things had failed at once? The Bureau of Prisons tried to explain. They spoke of staff shortages and overtime fatigue. They mentioned broken cameras and sleeping guards. Each explanation only raised more questions. How could so many security measures fail on the same night? Meanwhile, Epstein's legal team moved quickly. They had millions of dollars at their disposal and serious doubts about the official findings. Within days, they hired Dr. Michael Baden, a famous forensic pathologist with decades of experience. Baden had worked on some of America's most famous cases. He had examined evidence from the Kennedy assassination and the O.J. Simpson trial. His reputation was spotless. If anyone could find the truth, it would be him. The lawyers made their position clear. They wanted independent experts to review everything. They questioned the rushed timeline of the autopsy. They wondered why certain photographs weren't taken. They demanded access to evidence that might prove their client didn't kill himself. Prison officials found themselves under intense pressure. The media was asking tough questions. Families of Epstein's alleged victims wanted answers. Congressional leaders called for investigations. Everyone seemed to doubt the official story. The FBI began interviewing guards and reviewing security footage. Internal emails started leaking to the press. Each revelation made the situation look worse. Guards had falsified records. Required checks hadn't been performed. Basic protocols had been ignored. Public trust crumbled with each passing day. Social media exploded with theories and suspicions. The hashtag Epstein didn't kill himself began trending worldwide. Comedians made jokes during late-night shows. Even ordinary citizens who rarely followed news stories found themselves questioning what really happened. The conflict was clear. On one side stood the official medical examiner's report declaring suicide. On the other side grew a chorus of voices demanding more investigation. Epstein's lawyers, independent experts, and millions of skeptical Americans all wanted the same thing. They wanted proof that couldn't be questioned. They wanted answers that made sense. Most of all, they wanted to know if Jeffrey Epstein had really taken his own life, or if something far more sinister had occurred in that prison cell. The people closest to Jeffrey Epstein refused to stay quiet. While official reports painted a clear picture of suicide, those who knew him best began speaking out. Their words carried a weight that made the public listen even more carefully. Reed Weingarten, one of Epstein's defense attorneys, made his position crystal clear. He told reporters that his client had been looking forward to fighting the charges. Epstein was planning his defense strategy. He was meeting with lawyers regularly. Weingarten insisted that suicide made no sense for a man preparing to clear his name in court. The lawyer's statements hit the media like a thunderbolt. Here was someone who spent hours with Epstein just days before his death. Someone who saw his mental state firsthand. And this person was saying the official story didn't match reality. Then came an even more surprising voice. Epstein's brother, Mark, hired his own medical expert to examine the evidence. Mark Epstein rarely spoke to reporters, but he couldn't remain silent. He told journalists he found it impossible to believe his brother would kill himself. The family had questions that demanded answers. Perhaps most shocking were the comments from Epstein's longtime butler. This man had worked in Epstein's homes for years. He knew the billionaire's daily habits and moods better than almost anyone. The butler told news outlets that Epstein seemed focused on his legal case, not defeated by it. These weren't random strangers making wild claims. These were people who had direct access to Epstein. They saw him regularly. They knew his personality and his plans. Yet every single one of them questioned the suicide ruling. Their public statements created a new problem for authorities. The medical examiner had science and evidence on their side. But Epstein's inner circle had personal knowledge that seemed to contradict those findings. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Family members don't usually challenge suicide rulings unless they have serious reasons. Lawyers don't typically dispute official medical reports without cause. Household staff rarely speak to reporters about their employers' deaths. But this case was different. Each new statement from Epstein's contacts added fuel to the growing fire of suspicion. The public watched as people who knew him intimately rejected the official explanation. Their voices joined a growing chorus of doubt that would soon include forensic experts, former prisoners, and government watchdog groups. The question became more pressing with each passing day. If the people closest to Jeffrey Epstein couldn't accept that he killed himself, why should anyone else believe it? Investigations and errors behind the death. Something felt wrong from the very start. When news broke that Jeffrey Epstein had died in his jail cell, the FBI knew they had to act fast. Too many powerful people had connections to this man. Too many secrets hung in the balance. The FBI investigation began within hours. Agents rushed to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. They needed to preserve every piece of evidence before it could disappear. What they found painted a picture that made even seasoned investigators pause. The Department of Justice Inspector General launched their own probe. They had to understand how someone so closely watched could die on federal property. The initial reports raised red flags everywhere they looked. 2 guards were supposed to check on Epstein every 30 minutes. The logs showed they had done their job perfectly. But security footage told a different story. The guards had been asleep for hours. They woke up only when they discovered the body. The investigation revealed something even more troubling. The guards had falsified their records. They wrote down check times that never happened. They created a paper trail of supervision that was completely fake. But the cameras told the strangest story of all. The surveillance system that should have captured everything had mysteriously malfunctioned. Not all the cameras, just the ones that could see into Epstein's cell area. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidence. FBI forensic teams combed through every detail. They examined the bedsheets, the cell structure, the positioning of the body. They interviewed every staff member who had contact with Epstein in his final days. The Inspector General's report would later document a cascade of failures. Guards who didn't follow protocol. Supervisors who didn't supervise. Systems that broke down at the most critical moment. Investigators discovered that Epstein had been taken off suicide watch just days before his death. This decision came despite his previous attempt to harm himself. The reasoning behind this change became another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. The formal investigations painted a picture of incompetence so severe it seemed almost impossible. Multiple systems had to fail simultaneously for this death to occur. Each failure by itself might be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that left investigators with more questions than answers. The FBI's final conclusions would satisfy some observers, but leave others wondering if they had seen only part of the truth. The official investigations had done their job, documenting every failure and every mistake. Yet somehow, the biggest questions remained unanswered. The 2 guards who were supposed to watch Jeffrey Epstein that night had one simple job. Check on him every 30 minutes. Write it down. Keep him alive. Instead, they did something that shocked investigators and raised new questions about what really happened. Tova Noel and Michael Thomas were experienced correctional officers at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. They had worked there for years. They knew the rules. They understood how important their job was that night. But according to federal prosecutors, they spent their shift doing online shopping and taking naps. The surveillance footage from the guard station painted a picture that seemed almost unbelievable. For hours, both guards appeared to be asleep at their desk. When they were awake, they browsed the internet for furniture and motorcycles. They never once got up to check on Epstein. The logbooks told a different story. Someone had filled in the required checks every 30 minutes. Each entry showed that guards had walked the halls and looked into every cell. The paperwork was perfect and complete, but the security cameras proved these checks never happened. Federal agents charged both guards with conspiracy and falsifying records. The charges carried serious prison time. These weren't minor mistakes or forgotten paperwork. Prosecutors said the guards had deliberately lied about doing their jobs on the most important night of their careers. The guards initially pleaded not guilty. They claimed they were overworked and understaffed. The jail was short on personnel. They had been working overtime for weeks. Exhaustion had caught up with them at the worst possible moment. But critics found this explanation troubling. How do 2 experienced guards both fall asleep at the same time? How do they both forget to do the most basic part of their job? How do they both decide to falsify the same records in the same way? The timing felt too convenient. The failures too complete. Eventually, both guards accepted a deal with prosecutors. They admitted to their crimes, but avoided prison time. They had to perform community service and cooperate with ongoing investigations. Yet their plea agreements left many questions hanging in the air. What exactly had they seen that night? Had anyone else been involved? Were they covering up something bigger than just sleeping on the job? The guards themselves remained mostly silent after their court appearances. They gave no interviews. They offered no explanations beyond what the legal documents required. Their conduct had created a gap in the official record, a window of time when no one was watching the most watched prisoner in America. The cameras tell their own strange story. In a prison where every breath should be recorded, the surveillance system failed at the worst possible moment. 2 cameras outside Epstein's cell broke down hours before his death. These were not old, worn-out devices. They had worked fine just days earlier. Prison officials called it equipment failure. Bad timing, they said. Nothing more than unfortunate coincidence. But inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, cameras rarely failed. The system had backup after backup, redundancies built on top of redundancies. Yet somehow, the eyes that should have watched Epstein went blind. The camera breakdown wasn't the only rule that bent that night. Standard procedure demanded that high-risk prisoners like Epstein remain under constant watch. A guard should have checked on him every 30 minutes. These checks weren't suggestions. They were ironclad requirements written in blood from past mistakes. But the rules dissolved into air. No one verified that Epstein was alive during those crucial hours. The logbooks showed check marks where there should have been real observations. Guard signatures appeared next to times when those same guards were fast asleep. Even stranger, Epstein's cellmate had been transferred just hours before the incident. For weeks, another prisoner had shared that cramped space. Suddenly, without explanation, officials moved the man to a different cell. They left Epstein completely alone, despite clear protocols requiring constant companionship for suicide risk inmates. The combination felt too perfect to be random. Broken cameras, sleeping guards, missing cellmate. Each failure created a small crack in the system. Together, they formed a canyon wide enough for the impossible to happen. Prison experts scratched their heads. In 40 years of corrections work, many had never seen so many safeguards fail simultaneously. It defied logic. Security systems don't collapse in perfect harmony unless something forces them to break. The timing made investigators pause. Epstein had just been removed from suicide watch days earlier. Prison psychologists had declared him mentally stable, ready for normal housing conditions. Yet somehow, in this brief window of reduced monitoring, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Had someone deliberately disabled those cameras? Were the guards truly asleep, or were they paid to look away? Did higher authorities order the cellmate transfer? Each broken protocol pointed towards something more complex than simple negligence. The official reports mentioned these failures, but treated them as separate, unrelated incidents. Random bad luck piled upon more random bad luck. But patterns this precise rarely happen by accident. Something had orchestrated this perfect storm of procedural collapse. Legal and public reactions post-death. The moment Jeffrey Epstein's body was discovered in his cell, something strange happened in the world of law. The massive federal case against him simply vanished into thin air. Within hours of the death announcement, prosecutors filed papers that seemed almost routine. Yet these documents carried enormous weight. They asked the court to dismiss all criminal charges against Epstein. The reason was simple, but chilling. You cannot prosecute a dead man. The legal system had spent months building a fortress of evidence. Prosecutors claimed they had victims ready to testify. They spoke of mountains of documents and photos seized from his mansion. They painted pictures of a criminal network that stretched across the globe. Then suddenly, it all stopped. The case that had dominated headlines for weeks disappeared from court dockets. No trial would happen. No victims would face their alleged abuser in court. The evidence that investigators had worked so hard to gather would never be presented to a jury. But something curious began to happen almost immediately. While Epstein's case died with him, investigators did not pack up and go home. Instead, they turned their attention to the people around him. Ghislaine Maxwell became the new focus. The woman who had stood beside Epstein for decades now found herself in the crosshairs. Prosecutors began building a new case, this time with her name at the center. Other names started appearing in sealed documents and whispered conversations. Associates who had once felt protected by their distance from direct charges suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. The investigation had shapeshifted. What began as a case against one powerful man evolved into something much larger. Prosecutors started talking about networks and conspiracies. They spoke of enablers and participants who helped make alleged crimes possible. This shift raised uncomfortable questions. Had Epstein's death actually helped or hurt the pursuit of justice? Some argued that his associates, no longer protected by loyalty or fear, might now tell their stories. Others worried that the key figure who could have named names was gone forever. The legal machinery that had ground to a halt with Epstein's death began moving again. But this time, it moved in different directions, toward different targets. Maxwell's arrest came nearly a year later. When FBI agents found her hiding in New Hampshire, they brought with them charges that painted her as far more than just an assistant. According to prosecutors, she was a central player in recruiting and abusing young women. The case against Epstein was dead, but the hunt for truth was just beginning. Maxwell wasn't the only one. As FBI agents worked through Epstein's black book, more names surfaced. Each page revealed connections that stretched across decades. Phone numbers, addresses, personal notes scrawled in margins. The first arrest sent shockwaves through elite circles. A banker who had managed Epstein's accounts found himself facing federal charges. His lawyers claimed he knew nothing about the alleged crimes, but prosecutors painted a different picture. They showed bank transfers, payments to young women, money moving through shell companies in ways that made experienced investigators raise their eyebrows. Then came the pilots. Two men who had flown Epstein's private jet for years suddenly found themselves in courtrooms. Prosecutors wanted to know about passenger lists, flight logs, who traveled where and when. The pilots insisted they were just doing their jobs, flying passengers from point A to point B. Nothing more. Maxwell's trial became the centerpiece of this legal storm. For weeks, cameras gathered outside the courthouse as survivors told their stories. Their words painted a picture of systematic abuse, a machine designed to find, groom, and exploit vulnerable young women. The jury heard recordings. They saw photos. They studied financial records that showed payments to alleged victims. Maxwell's defense team argued she was being used as a scapegoat. They claimed prosecutors needed someone to blame now that Epstein was gone. But the evidence kept mounting. Survivors described Maxwell's role in detail. How she would approach young women at shopping centers and beaches. How she would invite them to massage training sessions at Epstein's properties. How those sessions turned into something far more sinister. The conviction came after days of deliberation. Maxwell was found guilty on 5 of 6 counts. The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom as families of survivors wept quietly in the gallery. Other cases moved through the system like dominoes falling. A music executive, a tech entrepreneur, a European prince who found his reputation destroyed by association. Some faced criminal charges. Others battled civil lawsuits that dragged their names through headlines for months. Each trial raised the same haunting questions. How many people knew? How many turned away? How did such a network operate for so long without detection? The legal fallout spread far beyond individual prosecutions. Investigators found themselves examining entire institutions. Banks that processed suspicious transactions, private security companies that provided services, even charities that had accepted Epstein's donations faced scrutiny. Prison officials watched nervously as congressional hearings began. Questions about security failures, about how such a high-profile prisoner could die on their watch. The spotlight was growing brighter, and more secrets were about to emerge. The prison walls could not contain the storm that followed. Phone calls flooded congressional offices. Angry voices demanded answers that officials could not give. How does a man under suicide watch end up dead? How do security cameras mysteriously fail at the exact moment needed most? Families of other prisoners came forward with their own horror stories. Guards who fell asleep on duty. Medical care that arrived too late. Prisoners left alone for hours when they should have been watched. The Metropolitan Correctional Center became a symbol of everything wrong with America's prison system. Politicians who had never spoken about prison conditions suddenly found their voices. Democrats and Republicans agreed on something rare. The system had failed completely. Senator after senator stood before television cameras, promising investigations and change. But their words felt hollow to many who had been fighting for prison reform for decades. The Bureau of Prisons tried to defend itself. Officials pointed to budget cuts and staff shortages. They spoke of aging facilities and outdated equipment. But their explanations only made people angrier. If they could not protect the most famous prisoner in America, how could they protect anyone? Advocacy groups seized the moment. Organizations that had spent years in obscurity suddenly found themselves invited to speak at hearings. They brought photos of overcrowded cells and stories of preventable deaths. They had documented patterns of neglect long before Epstein arrived at the facility. The media began digging deeper into prison conditions across the country. Reporters found similar failures everywhere they looked. Guards working double shifts until exhaustion set in. Security systems that had not been updated in years. Medical staff stretched too thin to provide proper care. Public pressure mounted like water behind a dam ready to burst. Town halls filled with concerned citizens. Online petitions gathered millions of signatures. The question was no longer just about what happened to Jeffrey Epstein. It had become about something much bigger. Congressional hearings began in earnest. Prison officials sat uncomfortably as lawmakers grilled them about procedures and protocols. Each answer seemed to raise 3 new questions. The deeper they dug, the more problems they found. Reform bills started appearing on desks in Washington. Some called for better funding. Others demanded new oversight procedures. A few proposed complete restructuring of how federal prisons operated. But translating outrage into lasting change would prove harder than anyone imagined. The ghost of Jeffrey Epstein had done something unexpected. His death had focused national attention on a system that operated in shadows. Whether that attention would create real reform remained to be seen. Emerging theories and conspiracy claims. Something strange happened in the hours after news broke. The internet exploded with questions nobody could answer. How does the most watched prisoner in America die alone in his cell? Why did the cameras stop working at just that moment? These questions spread faster than wildfire. People started connecting dots that painted a troubling picture. Epstein knew secrets about presidents, princes, and billionaires. His little black book read like a who's who of the world's elite. Many of these powerful people had everything to lose if he talked. The timing felt too perfect, too convenient. The details made things worse. 2 guards were supposed to check on him every 30 minutes. They fell asleep. The cameras that should have recorded everything mysteriously failed. His cellmate had been moved out just hours before. Each fact felt like another piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Within days, a simple phrase began appearing everywhere. Epstein didn't kill himself. It showed up on protest signs, social media posts, and even live television broadcasts. The phrase became a joke and a rallying cry at the same time. People who rarely agreed on anything found themselves nodding together about this one thing. The official story felt hollow to millions of Americans. Here was a man who had survived a previous attempt on his life just weeks earlier. Prison officials had placed him on suicide watch, then mysteriously removed it. He had told his lawyers he feared for his safety. Yet somehow, he managed to hang himself in a cell designed to prevent exactly that. Medical experts raised their own red flags. The fractures in Epstein's neck bone looked more like strangulation than hanging. The angle of his body didn't match what you'd expect from suicide. Even the bedsheet he allegedly used seemed too flimsy for the job. Social media algorithms fed the growing suspicion. Every anomaly got magnified and shared thousands of times. The more people learned about the inconsistencies, the more convinced they became that something darker had happened. The official investigation moved slowly, while public doubt grew by the hour. What started as whispered suspicions became mainstream conversation. Late-night comedians joked about it. Politicians referenced it. Even people who typically trusted government explanations found themselves questioning this one. The story had too many holes, too many coincidences, too many powerful people with too much to hide. The phrase itself became bigger than the case. It represented something deeper. A growing distrust of official narratives when powerful people might benefit from certain outcomes. The whispers had grown into a roar. By late 2019, something remarkable was happening across America. Pollsters who usually asked about elections and policy issues found themselves asking a different kind of question. Did Jeffrey Epstein really kill himself? The numbers were shocking. Poll after poll revealed the same troubling pattern. Most Americans simply didn't believe the official story. A Rasmussen poll in August 2019 found that only 29% of voters believed Epstein had died by suicide. Nearly half suspected he was murdered. The rest weren't sure, but they knew something felt wrong. These weren't fringe conspiracy theorists responding to internet surveys. These were regular voters from both parties, all backgrounds, all ages. When Emerson College asked the same question, they found similar results. Young people were especially skeptical. College students who had grown up questioning authority found the official explanation laughable. The geographic spread was striking too. Rural voters in Kansas shared doubts with urban professionals in New York. Conservative Republicans agreed with liberal Democrats on almost nothing else. But they agreed on this. Something about Epstein's death didn't add up. Social media made these feelings impossible to ignore. The polling data reflected what everyone could see online. Millions of posts questioned the official narrative. The phrase had become a cultural touchstone, appearing everywhere from football games to late-night television. When pollsters asked specifically about that phrase, recognition rates approached 90%. What made these numbers so significant was their persistence. Usually, public skepticism about official stories fades over time. People move on to new concerns. But months after Epstein's death, the doubt only seemed to grow stronger. Follow-up polls showed even higher levels of suspicion. The demographic breakdowns revealed fascinating patterns. Younger Americans were more skeptical than older ones. People who followed the news closely were more doubtful than casual news consumers. Even people who typically trusted government institutions found themselves questioning this particular case. International polls showed similar trends. British surveys found widespread doubt about the American investigation. French polling revealed deep suspicion about the circumstances. The story had become a global phenomenon, with skepticism crossing cultural and national boundaries. Perhaps most telling were the polls that asked why people doubted the official story. The top reasons matched exactly what conspiracy theorists had been saying. Too many powerful people had reasons to want Epstein silenced. Too many security failures happened at once. Too many questions remained unanswered. These weren't random opinions formed in ignorance. They were informed doubts based on publicly available information. The polling data confirmed what had become obvious to anyone paying attention. A significant portion of the public had lost faith in the official explanation. The numbers painted a clear picture. Public trust in this particular government investigation had collapsed almost completely. Something strange happened in the hours after Jeffrey Epstein's death was announced. Politicians from both parties began making statements that sounded less like official responses and more like whispered doubts. They weren't defending the investigation. They were questioning it. Within days, prominent figures were openly expressing skepticism. Some used careful language, talking about serious questions that needed answers. Others were more direct. They flat out said they didn't believe the suicide story. These weren't fringe voices speaking from the shadows. These were senators, governors, and former officials with access to classified information. The media response was equally telling. Instead of simply reporting the official cause of death, news anchors raised eyebrows. Investigative journalists started digging into prison procedures. Cable news hosts brought on experts who pointed out problems with the suicide explanation. Even mainstream outlets that usually stick to official narratives began asking uncomfortable questions. Social media exploded with celebrity voices adding their doubts. Comedians made jokes that weren't really jokes. They were serious accusations wrapped in humor. Television personalities used their platforms to list all the things that seemed wrong about the official story. Musicians wrote songs about government cover-ups. The skepticism spread from person to person, amplified by famous voices. This created something dangerous for those who wanted the official story to stick. When trusted public figures express doubt, regular people feel permission to doubt too. When celebrities question government explanations, their followers start questioning everything. The skepticism became acceptable, even fashionable. Media coverage began focusing on the strange details that didn't make sense. Why were the cameras broken? How do two guards both fall asleep? Why was the cell check skipped? News programs ran segments comparing Epstein's case to other suspicious deaths. They showed patterns that made viewers uncomfortable. The coverage created a feedback loop. Public figures saw the media questioning the story, so they felt safe to question it too. Media outlets saw important people expressing doubts, so they covered those doubts as news. Each story made the next person more willing to speak up. The skepticism grew and spread like wildfire. What started as whispered questions became shouted accusations. The climate changed completely. Believing the official suicide story became the unusual position. Questioning it became normal. Trusting the government's explanation made someone seem naive. This shift in public discourse did something powerful. It made conspiracy theories feel legitimate. When senators and news anchors are asking the same questions as internet theorists, those theories don't seem crazy anymore. They seem reasonable. They seem like the smart position to take. The influence of these high-profile voices cannot be understated. They transformed public doubt from a fringe position into mainstream skepticism. They made questioning the official story feel patriotic rather than paranoid. Government reviews disputing conspiracies. The heavy wooden doors of the Justice Department swung open on a cold morning in January 2020. Inside, investigators carried boxes filled with papers, photos, and recordings. They had one mission that would take months to complete. The FBI had already spent over a year studying every detail of what happened in that Manhattan jail cell. Now the Justice Department wanted their own answers. They knew millions of people around the world were asking the same question. Did Jeffrey Epstein really kill himself? The team started with the basics. They studied the jail records from that night in August 2019. Guard schedules, camera footage, phone calls, medical reports. Every piece of paper that existed about those final hours. What they found surprised no one who had worked similar cases before. The evidence pointed in one clear direction. Epstein had taken his own life. The autopsy results showed classic signs of hanging. The position of injuries on his neck matched exactly what doctors expect to see in suicide cases. No signs of a struggle. No marks that would suggest someone else was involved. The investigators talked to every guard who worked that shift. They reviewed security footage from hallways and common areas. They checked visitor logs and phone records. They even studied the jail's construction plans to see if someone could have entered the cell area without being detected. Nothing suggested murder. Nothing hinted at a cover-up. The Justice Department released their findings in a thick report. Page after page of evidence supported the same conclusion the FBI had reached. Epstein died by his own hand while alone in his cell. But the investigators went further. They addressed each major conspiracy theory directly. Claims about mysterious visitors? The visitor log showed no unusual activity. Stories about cameras being turned off. The working cameras captured everything investigators needed to see. The report even tackled wilder theories about secret government involvement. Teams reviewed classified files and interviewed intelligence officials. They found no evidence that any agency had reason to silence Epstein. Medical examiners from other states reviewed the autopsy independently. They reached the same conclusions about cause of death. The Justice Department knew their findings would not satisfy everyone. Conspiracy theories have a way of surviving even the strongest evidence. But they had done their job. They had followed the facts wherever they led. The truth was simpler than the theories. A man facing disgrace and life in prison had chosen to end his story on his own terms. Something else bothered people even more than the suicide itself. Whispers spread about a secret list. A list of powerful people who had visited Epstein. Rich men, famous politicians, business leaders who ran the world from shadows. The stories grew wild in the darkness of the internet. People said Epstein had been killed to protect these names. They imagined assassins slipping into his cell. They pictured government agents covering up crimes that reach the highest levels of power. The Department of Justice knew these stories would not die easily, so they looked for this famous list. They searched through every file Epstein owned. They examined his computers. They questioned his assistants and his lawyers. What they found surprised no one who worked the case. There was no master list of clients, no book of secrets that could bring down presidents. Epstein kept some names in different places, yes, but nothing like the treasure map of scandal that people imagined. Investigators checked bank records going back years. They traced money moving between accounts. They looked at flight logs from private jets. They found evidence of crimes, certainly, but they found no proof that powerful people had ordered Epstein's death. The agents who worked this case were not naive. They understood how corruption worked. They knew that wealthy people could buy silence, but buying silence was different from ordering murder. The evidence simply was not there. Phone records from that night showed nothing strange. Security cameras captured no mysterious visitors. Guards made their normal rounds, even if they fell asleep. No one had slipped poison into Epstein's food. No one had strangled him and made it look like hanging. The medical evidence remained clear. Epstein had tied a sheet around his neck. He had hung himself from his bunk. The injuries matched this method exactly. Other pathologists had examined the same evidence. they reached identical conclusions. People wanted a bigger story. They wanted villains with power and reach. They wanted conspiracies that explained how the world really worked. But sometimes the simple answer was the right answer. A desperate man had chosen death over disgrace. He had cheated justice, yes. He had escaped punishment for his crimes. But he had done this through his own hands, not through the hands of mysterious killers. The truth felt small compared to the theories, but truth often does. When the questions kept coming, government officials knew silence would only feed the fire. The FBI opened their doors to reporters. They held press conferences. They answered the same questions over and over again. "Show us the cameras," people demanded. So they did. The FBI released footage from the prison hallways. They showed timestamps. They showed guards walking their rounds. The cameras outside Epstein's cell had malfunctioned, yes, but dozens of other cameras worked perfectly. None showed mysterious visitors. None showed unknown faces in the corridors. The Justice Department went further. They published a detailed timeline of that final night. Every guard check was documented. Every procedure was listed. When guards fell asleep, the reports said so. When protocols were broken, they admitted it. The failures were embarrassing, but they were human failures. Tired workers, broken systems. Nothing more sinister than that. Attorney General William Barr faced the cameras himself. His words were clear and direct. "I have personally reviewed the evidence," he said. This was suicide. He knew people would not believe him. He knew his words would be picked apart, but he said them anyway. The Bureau of Prisons changed their rules after Epstein died. High-profile prisoners would be watched more carefully. Camera systems would be upgraded. Guards would face stricter oversight. These changes meant admitting mistakes had been made. It would have been easier to stay quiet. Instead, they chose transparency. Congressional hearings followed. Senators asked tough questions. Prison officials sat at long tables under bright lights. They faced angry lawmakers and skeptical reporters. They could have hidden behind classified briefings. They could have refused to testify. Instead, they answered publicly. They showed their evidence to anyone who would look. The medical examiner's office took an unusual step. They invited outside experts to review their work. Independent pathologists studied the autopsy photos. They examined tissue samples. They reached the same conclusions. Suicide by hanging. No signs of assault. No evidence of murder. Some agencies released documents that had never been meant for public eyes. Internal emails showed the confusion of that morning. Phone calls revealed the panic when guards found the body. These communications were messy and human. They showed real people dealing with a crisis, not masterminds covering up a crime. The government's response was unprecedented in its openness. Officials knew that answering conspiracy theories often gave them more attention. They knew their transparency might not convince everyone, but they chose to share their findings anyway. They believed that truth, even uncomfortable truth, was better than silence. Social and political impact of the Epstein case. Something strange happened the night Jeffrey Epstein died. The cameras stopped working. Guards fell asleep. A man on suicide watch was left alone. These facts created more than questions. They created a symbol. In coffee shops and online forums, people whispered the same words. He knew too much. The story spread like wildfire through communities already suspicious of those in power. Epstein's name became code for something bigger, something darker. The wealthy financier had connections everywhere. Presidents, princes, business leaders, scientists. His private island hosted the world's elite. His black book contained names that made headlines. When he died in that Manhattan jail cell, those connections didn't disappear. They haunted the public mind. Conspiracy communities seized on every detail. The broken bones in his neck, the missing video footage, the guards who weren't watching. Each piece felt like evidence of a cover-up. Not just any cover-up, but proof that powerful people protect each other. Always. Epstein didn't kill himself became more than a theory. It became a battle cry. People printed it on t-shirts. They spray-painted it on walls. They shouted it at rallies. The phrase meant something deeper than one man's death. It meant the system was rigged. Working-class Americans saw Epstein's story as proof of what they already believed. Rich people play by different rules. They escape consequences. They silence threats. Regular folks go to prison for small crimes, while billionaires with terrible secrets somehow avoid justice. The timing made everything worse. Trust in government was already cracking. Faith in media was fading. People felt lied to about wars, economics, and corruption. Epstein's death landed like a match on dry wood. Social media amplified every suspicion. Ordinary citizens became detectives, sharing photos and documents. They connected dots between famous names and suspicious timing. Professional investigators might have missed details, but the crowd missed nothing. The symbol grew stronger, with each official explanation that felt incomplete. Each time authorities said suicide, more people heard cover-up. Each time experts dismissed theories, more citizens felt dismissed themselves. Epstein's death revealed something uncomfortable about modern society. The distance between those who govern and those who are governed had grown too wide. Trust had been broken too many times. When something suspicious happened to someone with connections this powerful, belief in coincidence died. The financier's story became a mirror reflecting deeper fears. If they could silence him, who else might they silence? If justice failed here, where else might it fail? These questions turned Epstein's name into something more than memory. It became a warning about power unchecked and secrets too dangerous to survive. Politicians discovered something powerful in Jeffrey Epstein's story. His name carried weight that could shift entire conversations. When debates grew heated, someone would mention Epstein. The room would change. Suddenly, abstract discussions about corruption became personal and real. Campaign speeches began featuring his case as proof that elites lived by different rules. Candidates from both sides found ways to weave his story into their messages. They spoke of two-tiered justice systems and powerful people who escaped consequences. The dead financier became a weapon in political warfare. News anchors learned that Epstein's segments drew viewers. His photograph on screen meant ratings would climb. Stories about his connections filled primetime slots. Each revelation about his associates sent social media into overdrive. The public consumed these updates like a mystery series that never ended. Talk show hosts built entire episodes around his case. They invited experts who spoke in careful tones about what his death really meant. Guest after guest explained how his story revealed cracks in the system. These discussions always ended with the same troubling question: who else might be protected? Cultural critics noticed something strange happening. Epstein's name had become shorthand for institutional failure. Writers used his case to explore themes of power and corruption. Documentary filmmakers raced to tell his story first. His face appeared on book covers and magazine spreads across the world. Social media amplified every theory and suspicion. Hashtags bearing his name trended regularly. Users shared lists of his famous friends and demanded investigations. Comment sections filled with questions that authorities seemed unwilling or unable to answer. The digital age meant his story could never truly die. Late-night comedians found dark humor in the situation. Their jokes carried bitter undertones about justice and fairness. Audiences laughed, but the laughter felt hollow. Everyone understood the real meaning behind the punchlines. Comedy became another way to process the uncomfortable truth. Political fundraising emails began mentioning his case. Donors responded to messages promising to fight the kind of corruption his story represented. money flowed toward candidates who promised transparency and accountability. His death had created a new political currency. Art installations appeared in galleries, featuring imagery connected to his story. Musicians wrote songs about power and its abuses. Poets crafted verses about secrets that died with their keepers. Creative minds found inspiration in the darkness of his tale. The powerful financier's legacy had spread far beyond his crimes. His story now lived in the spaces where politics and culture meet. Every discussion about elite privilege carried echoes of his name. He had become a symbol that could not be erased, a reminder of questions that demanded answers. The cameras never stopped rolling after Jeffrey Epstein's death. Within weeks of that August morning, film crews descended on the story like moths to flame. Documentary makers sensed something the public craved. They knew people wanted answers to questions that seemed to multiply with each passing day. Netflix released its first series just months later. Amazon followed with another. Each production promised new revelations. They interviewed former guards, forensic experts, and conspiracy researchers. The footage showed shadowy prison corridors and talking heads against dark backgrounds. Viewers watched by the millions. Publishers rushed books to market. Former associates wrote tell-all memoirs. Investigative journalists compiled thick volumes of evidence and speculation. True crime podcasts dissected every detail for hours at a time. The story had found its place in the endless hunger for mystery content. Social media amplified every theory. Hashtags trended weekly. Memes spread faster than official statements. Young people who barely knew his name before his death became experts on prison protocols and autopsy findings. The story lived and breathed in comment sections and group chats. News outlets discovered that Epstein stories guaranteed clicks. Every anniversary brought fresh coverage. New documents released through legal proceedings sparked fresh rounds of analysis. Cable news panels debated the same questions over and over. The cycle never ended. Late-night comedians found dark humor in the situation. Epstein didn't kill himself became a punchline that audiences expected. The phrase appeared on t-shirts and bumper stickers. What started as genuine suspicion transformed into cultural shorthand for institutional failure. Hollywood began developing feature films. Scripts circulated with thinly veiled characters and familiar plot points. Streaming services competed for projects that might capture the public mood. Writers struggled to separate fact from fiction in stories that already felt like impossible fiction. The fascination crossed all boundaries. Conservative talk shows and liberal podcasts covered the same ground. Religious leaders spoke about corruption in high places. Academic conferences included panels on media coverage of controversial deaths. The story belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. Families affected by his crimes watched this media circus with mixed feelings. Some welcomed the attention that kept their cases in public view. Others felt overwhelmed by the constant speculation that seemed to overshadow their suffering. The victims' voices sometimes got lost in the noise. Each new documentary promised the final word. Each book claimed exclusive insights. Yet the questions persisted. The media machine that fed on mystery had found its perfect subject. A story that could never be fully resolved meant content that would never stop flowing. The public appetite seemed bottomless. Years passed, but the fascination remained fresh. New generations discovered the story through algorithms and recommendations. The mystery had become immortal in the digital age.